All right, so we're early in the reign of King Solomon. And does anyone remember when Solomon becomes king, the year? We talked about the conservative view of the year. That's, someone told me I'm pronouncing it wrong. Solomon. I say Solomon. It's like Sullivan or whatever, you know. It's quick, it's easy. So I'm just going to keep saying Solomon. Someone else likes to mess with the way I say the word fool. You know, I feel fool, but whatever. So what year did Solomon, I'm going to be thinking it every time I say it. What year did Solomon become king? 970. All right, 970. So from early on, it becomes clear that he needs this thing and doesn't have it. Wisdom. He doesn't have wisdom. He needs it from the Lord and from his word. Over the last couple of weeks, what we've been seeing is Solomon kind of building, he's been preparing for and building the temple. And he begins that temple in the 4th year of his reign, which we're going to call 966, although you could call it 967 if you want. We're going to call it 966. And it takes him 7.5 years, because if you count 970 as the first year, but we're going to say 966. And it takes 7.5 years to complete that temple. But the key part of last week's message was God's promise to Solomon when God spoke. If you remember, we had that V outline, right? A, B, C, D, God speaks, C, B, A type of a thing. That's how we looked at last week's message. God had offered to extend the promise to David. He had offered to extend that Davidic promise through the line of Solomon, but Solomon had to remain faithful. Now, the temple is an important building, but Jesus, we saw, was greater than the temple. Remember, Jesus is going to sacrifice himself on the cross. All of this points toward Jesus, right? Jesus fulfills it all. He would become the sacrifice that satisfies God's wrath. Today, we see more about that temple, but not without something interesting, something that gives us a glimpse at Solomon and at Solomon's priorities. And when we look at Solomon and Solomon's priorities, we can think about our own and examine whether our priorities are right too. Now, I'm going to warn you in advance. We are not going to look at every verse in this chapter. This is a long chapter, and you probably wouldn't want me to. You'd probably be like, "Oh man, come on, are you kidding me? You're going to read all the." I'm going to ask you. You go ahead and you read some of those at home later on. What I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of look at some of the highlight portions of certain parts of this passage. I'm going to deal with stuff that's significant, and I'm going to leave some of those details for you to go home and read. So just be aware. I'm not like ignoring some part of Scripture that disproves my theology or anything like that. There's some details about what items look like or were made or measurements or some things like that we're just not going to look at tonight. So you can go home. You can read those, and if you have any questions about any of those, you can ask me about them, and we could deal with those. But I suspect you probably, you're probably, by the end of the night, you'd be thankful that we didn't really examine every single verse in this passage. Anyway, we see today that Solomon builds a glorious, costly palace. Okay, now we're dealing with Solomon's palace. Now, notice how long it takes. Now, Solomon was building his own house 13 years. And he finished all his house. I find something interesting when I read that. What do you find interesting? Okay, 13 years seems like a while, especially when compared to 7 years, right? 7.5 years. So now remember, the Hebrew text in its original form didn't have chapter and verse divisions. They came along later. So if you're reading the Hebrew scroll, you're reading, in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished throughout all its parts and according to all its plans. So he was 7 years in building it. And then the very next sentence would say, now Solomon was building his own house 13 years. And so juxtaposed or set against, or however word you want to use, these two ideas are set against each other. He built the house of the Lord. It took 7.5 years. Solomon, and this word now, it's interesting because we would look for a Hebrew word, but what it is it's a Hebrew letter. It's just a Hebrew letter, and it's a vav, and that vav, it looks like the symbol on the mountain energy. No, maybe not. It's just a little thing like this. That's all it is, and it can mean any conjunction. It can mean and, even. It can mean also. It could be but. It could be contrastive, or it could be something like now. So you could actually translate it, but you could. But Solomon was building his own house. All right, so you have this contrast that's set up. It takes Solomon 13 years to build his own house, and I would say that putting these two verses together is not an accident. The writer wants us to see this. He wants us to notice the difference. Now, there are a few ways you could look at that. You could say, hey, listen, Solomon really wanted to prioritize the house of the Lord, and that's why it only took 7.5 years. Whereas his palace took 13 years, and so that shows that Solomon he's really focused on getting the house built. But I would argue that if you're paying attention to the passage, you'd come to the opposite conclusion. I would argue that as you're looking, and we'll see some of this, as you're looking at the passage, you're going to see Solomon really is spending a lot of time and a lot of money to build his house. And it seems that house is a greater priority to him at that time in his life than the house of the Lord. It seems that could be. The passage suggests that. Check it out. Let's see why I could come to that conclusion. Solomon was building his own house 13 years, and he finished all his house. He built the house of the forest of Lebanon. Its length was 100 cubits, and its width 50 cubits, and its height, my Hebrew professor used to call it height. Its height, Dr. McLean, its height is not, right? That's not it. I always heard, this guy's got like advanced doctorates, and he's calling it height. Anyway, whatever. And its height was 30 cubits, on 4 rows of cedar pillars with cedar beams on the pillars. So Solomon's palace is called the house of the forest of Lebanon. You remember, Lebanon is filled with cedar trees, which are really tall, and it's strong. It's expensive wood. All right. So this place is called the house of the forest of Lebanon. Like there's so much wood, there's so much value that goes into it. The name itself speaks of it's almost like a forest of wood. It's so valuable. It's extravagant. Notice the sheer size of this place compared to the temple. Now, I'm going to give you the numbers, okay? And you do the math. So what we have is, remember, we're just, for sake of ease, we're calling a cubit 1.5 feet, okay? Now it could be 20 inches or whatever. But we're going to call it 1.5 feet. So if 100 cubits if 1 cubit is 1.5 feet, then 100 cubits is how many feet? 150 feet. So it's 150 feet long. Anyone remember the measurement of this room from last week? From those doors to this wall. 74 by, anyone remember? It was 41. AJ, what were you going to say? 41. That was 41. All right, 74 by 41. And the house of the Lord, if you remember, was how many feet? 90 by 30, 2,700 square feet, okay? This is 150 feet by 75 feet, which is 11,250 feet. So you're talking about Solomon's palace being 11,250 square feet versus the house of the Lord, which is only 2,700 square feet. That's over 4 times bigger. Solomon's palace is over 4 times bigger than the temple of the Lord. Okay? I don't know anything about building. I'm not a construction worker, all right? But as a writer, I'm noticing that building is 4 times bigger than the other building and only took twice as long to build, not even twice as long to build. Again, a construction guy might come in and say, hey, idiot, it's not going to take 4 times longer to build that. You know what I mean? I just don't know. I don't know any of that. But what I'm seeing as a writer is a building that's 4 times the size of the other one takes less than twice as long to build. That tells me that energy and time is put into that building from an amateur's perspective. Solomon appears to be, if nothing else, you could take out of it, hey, look at the size of this thing. His palace is 4 times bigger. His palace is 4 times bigger than the house of the Lord. All right. Putting considerable money and effort into his own house when compared to the house of the Lord. And this is yet another crack in Solomon's armor. You might remember the first one, which was, what was the first crack in Solomon's armor? Marrying the Egyptian princess. We're going to come back to that in a second. Let's read. We're going to move down to verse 6. All right. So we have this huge hall that's built. Verse 6. Then he made the hall of pillars. So this is a huge hall for his throne room. And then he made the hall of pillars. Its length was 50 cubits, and its width 30 cubits, and a porch was in front of them, and pillars and a threshold in front of them. So that's 75 feet by 45 feet. What does that sound like in measurement? 75 by 45. That's almost exactly the size of this room. 74 by 41, 75 by 45. Basically, his hall of pillars was at least this size, all right, for his throne room. His palace is considerably bigger. His palace is 4 times bigger than that. So now we're not just talking about one building, the house of the Lord, which is 90 by 30, which is 2,700 square feet. We're talking about a hall of pillars, which is as big as this room, which is a little bit bigger than the house of the Lord, okay? And his palace, which is 4 times bigger than the house of the Lord. So we're not just talking about one structure here, we're talking about multiple structures here. We're talking about a complex of structures, and it only takes less than twice as long to build, all right? Anyway. And square footage, 3,375 square feet for his hall of pillars versus 2,700. Even that hall of pillars is bigger than the house of the Lord. Solomon makes a huge throne room. He made the hall of the throne where he was to judge, the hall of judgment, and it was paneled with cedar from floor to floor. You might call this his place of work, right? So he's got his palace where he lives, which is a mansion. About 1,100 square feet today. You know, my house is like 2,000 square feet, maybe a little more, maybe a little bit less. All right, so we're talking about 11,000 square feet for Solomon's house in the ancient world. That's huge. It's, as one former president would say, huge. Solomon made a house to live in. On top of that, even, his house where he was to live, the other court inward from the hall was of the same workmanship. He also made a house like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, so now whom Solomon had married. So he makes a house as big as the hall for her, a 3,300 square foot house for her. So now we're on at least our 3rd building, maybe 4th, depending on how you read it. We're either on our 3rd or on our 4th building here, okay, that Solomon's building. And not even twice as long as he's built the temple. Now, you might remember this Pharaoh's daughter from chapter 3 and verse 1. He should not even have married Pharaoh's daughter, and yet he married her in order to make an alliance with Egypt. In 1 Kings 3, verse 1, then Solomon formed a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. And so you might remember that Solomon took over during a time of peace, and so war wasn't really, he controlled all the trade routes, and so Pharaoh wants to have, it's going to be cheaper. Listen, you want to be family with a guy who has a monopoly, who has control over all the trading routes. All right, because that guy gets to tax people, he gets to whatever. You want to walk on his road, you want to go through his territory, you got to pay the toll. And so there's trade too. Since Solomon controls all this trade, now being family with Solomon, that's valuable. And for Solomon, it's the same thing, being family with Pharaoh, because everything that comes up through Africa goes through Egypt. And so it's a mutually beneficial relationship when it comes to politics or when it comes to finances, but not when it comes to spirituality, not when it comes to your walk with God. The move was sin. It was sin against the Lord. If you read Deuteronomy 7, it's clear that it was sin. Foreign women who worshipped other gods would ultimately be Solomon's destruction. It would take him away from the Lord and ruin him and ruin the people of God. I would argue that unfortunately too many people today make the same mistake that Solomon made. They follow their heart, right? Follow your heart. They become blinded by emotion and they make decisions that will affect the rest of their lives on the basis of a short period of time where they're feeling strong emotions. They believe what Hollywood. They live in a dream world. They believe what Hollywood tells them or what Disney tells them or whatever. They believe in fairy tale romantic love, and they believe in something called chemistry, and they believe in a man in a white horse, guy riding in on a white horse to save them and ride off into the sunset on a lawnmower. They think this person makes me happy instead of this person makes me holy, and they ignore God's truth. And I'm going to tell you, it's not just the kid's fault. It's the parents too. Because the parents look the other way. They turn a blind eye when one of the kids who are living in their house are dating a lost person, an unsaved person, a person who does not worship the Lord. They look the other way and say, let him live his life. He'll learn. Let him make his mistakes. Live and learn. Let them follow their heart instead of teaching them to guide it and to direct it towards what God says. What they're really doing is allowing their kids to live in sin and enabling it. That's what's going on. That's what's going on. Instead of calling their kids to accountability and obedience, you know what? One of the things we do as parents, one of the things we're supposed to be doing is discipling our kids. We're supposed to be teaching them what the Christian life is supposed to look like. I think too often we're just so permeated by the thoughts of the world that we don't even realize the mistakes that we can make. We think, hey, look, I don't want to force my kid to do this or force my kid to do that. But I'm going to tell you, as a parent, I know I'm off track here a little. I'm going to tell you, as long as they're under your roof, there are rules of the house, right? They're living in your house, and they're living for free in your house. And even if they're not living for free, even if they're paying rent, they're still living in your house. If you're living in my house, you're living by my rules, all right? And that's just what it is. I got a brother who's almost 10 years older than me, and he's living with his parents, all right? And I'm telling my parents, hey, you got rules. You make the rules. He's got to follow those rules. He should be paying rent, and he should be, But you can, in an act of trying to love your kid, you can actually be enabling them to continue in sin or to follow a path of sin. Solomon builds a palace. Solomon forms a marriage alliance with his foreign idolatrous wife. And this is not anything against interracial marriage. This is against interfaith marriage. That is clear for anyone who's paying attention to Scripture. And now he's building an extravagant palace for her. And he's using costly stones in verses 9 and 10. Check this out. All these were of costly stones, of stones cut according to measure, sawed with saws, inside and outside, even from the foundation to the coping. And so on the outside to the great court, the foundation was of costly stones, even large stones, stones of 15 feet and stones of 12 feet. That's how big these stones were. All right, huge, huge stones to build these houses. All right, gigantic stones. And all this shows how extravagant Solomon's temple complex, palace complex is compared to the temple. At least 3 houses here, at least. At least 3 large buildings. And each one of them is bigger than the temple that he builds to the Lord, it seems. The only one that's in question is Pharaoh's daughter's house, because we don't have the measurements there. We see Hiram the builder in verses 13 and 14, which we'll read through some of this pretty quickly. Now Solomon sent and brought Hiram from Tyre. He was a widow's son from the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a worker in bronze. And he was filled with wisdom and understanding and skill for doing any work in bronze. So he came to King Solomon and performed all his work. So this guy, Solomon spares no expense finding like the expert of the day, the guy who can work in things like bronze and things like gold and silver and iron and stone and purple and linen and crimson and engravings and all that stuff. This is the dude. All right, this is the guy you want. All right. Hiram built 2 pillars. He builds 2 pillars at the temple in verse 15. He fashioned 2 pillars of bronze, 18 cubits. That's 27 feet high, fashioned of bronze. 18 cubits high was the height of 1 pillar, and a line of 12 cubits measured the circumference of both. So these are pillars that are at the temple of the Lord. You see that down in verse 21. He set up the pillars at the porch of the nave and set up the right pillar and named it Jachin, and he set up the left pillar and named it Boaz. So you have these 2 large, for this period of this portion of the passage, we kind of return back to the building of the house of the Lord. So you have in chapter 5 and 6, you have the preparation for and the building of the house of the Lord. Here in chapter 7, you have this little snippet that's inserted about the extravagance of Solomon's complex of houses and halls and Pharaoh's daughter's house and all that stuff. And then we kind of go back to it's almost like, hey, let me tell you about the house of the Lord. Let me tell you how magnificent it is. He prepared for it. He built it. It took him 7.5 years. But, there was that 13 years where he built all these other extravagant things that were bigger and more costly than the temple. But then he built the bronze, all these things. That's kind of how this is reading. Okay, that's how the greater narrative. He built the pieces of furniture for the house of the Lord. And so that's kind of how I read these chapters. Anyway. You have these 2 large pillars. He makes a molten sea, which we looked at a little bit last week. Now, he made the sea of cast metal 10 cubits from brim to brim. That's 15 feet wide, 7.5 feet tall. Its height was 5 cubits and 30 cubits in circumference. It holds 11,500 gallons of water. I'll show you a picture of it in a second. It stood on 12 oxen, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, and 3 facing east. And the sea was set on top of them, and all their rear parts turned inward. So their heads were faced out. Here, I'll show you. Yeah, right there. So this is the molten sea. Got like a little guy standing next to it. And you could see, right, their heads are facing out underneath it, and it's just a huge water pot. I remember the first time I read the molten sea. I'm like, man. So I'm just picturing like this big, this long, like the floor. I'm just picturing like a metal floor that was, I don't know, like kind of like an oceany. I just didn't even understand what I was reading. Like, what in the world is a molten sea? Well, that's it. But this guy built it, right? And it's significant. It's a significant place because they're preparing for the ceremonial washings for the sacrifices that they're going to carry out. And the sacrifices there at the temple matter. Well, anyway, there are 10 bronze stands we read about in verse 27. Then he made the 10 stands of bronze. The length of each stand was 4 cubits, that's 6 feet. And the width 4 cubits, that's 6 feet. And the height 3 cubits, which is 4.5 feet. And each one of these things hold 230 gallons of water. And you'll see these are the stands. So you'll see 5 stands of what, so there's ready, we talked about this last week, there's ready access to water where the priest could go and they could wash and they could come back and they could make their sacrifices, or they could go into the temple of the Lord and they could offer burnt incense, or, and we'll see this, or they could offer bread and grain offerings on the table of showbread and different things like that. Yeah, 5 of them here, 5 of them on the other side. All right, so that's what we're kind of seeing in verses 27, and actually we see them again down to verse 38. He made 10 basins of bronze. One basin held 40 baths. Each basin was 4 cubits, and on each of the stands was 1 basin. He makes furniture and tools for the house of the Lord. Look at verse 40. Now Hiram made the basins and the shovels and the bowls. So Hiram finished doing all the work which he performed for King Solomon and the house of the Lord. We skip down to verse 48. Solomon made all the furniture which was in the house of the Lord, the golden altar and the golden table on which was the bread of the presence. So you have the incense altar, which is this little, do I have something? I thought I had something else. No. You have to look, it's the altar of incense offering, and what was the other thing here? The golden table on which was the bread of the presence, which is this little table here where you'd lay out loaves as an offering to the Lord. Okay. And the lampstands, 5 on the right side and 5 on the left in front of the inner sanctuary of pure gold, and the flowers and the lamps and the tongs of gold, and those lampstands are these golden lampstands, 5 on this side, right? And you see 5 on the left. And the cups and the snuffers and the bowls and the spoons and the fire pans of pure gold, all the instruments you need to carry out sacrifices. Because you need to shovel out the ashes, you need to do all that stuff, right? And the hinges, both for the doors of the inner house, the most holy place, and for the doors of the house that is of the nave of gold. And the house of the Lord is completed in verse 51. Thus, all the work that King Solomon performed in the house of the Lord was finished. And Solomon brought in the things dedicated by his father David, the silver and the gold and the utensils, and he put them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. The temple complex is complete and it's extravagant. But the impression you get when you read through the passage is that this little parenthesis about the rest of the complex, or I should say Solomon's complex, because it's not at the temple, it's outside in the city of David. You have the temple, you have the temple complex up here, all right, and you have Solomon's house outside of that. All right, in fact, down in here, you have probably right here, and you see this little structure here that you can still see some that exists today, where Solomon's temple, Solomon's palace would have been. So we're dealing with this whole structure of houses, and I don't know if this picture is perfect or exact or whatever, but you have an extravagant house that Solomon builds, spending more time on the house. It's bigger, it's more money, and yet we know that God is not impressed with buildings and sacrifices as much as he is with a contrite heart, with a repentant heart, with obedience. Eventually, this structure is going to be destroyed. And so is Solomon's palace. It's all going to be destroyed. In less than 400 years, the Israelites will become so far from the Lord, starting with Solomon's marriage to an unbeliever, continuing with his covetousness, continuing with his lust and his marriage and concubines of 1,000 women, continuing and resulting in his idolatry, which leads the whole nation into idolatry, which causes the nation of Israel to split. They continue in and out of idolatry until 400 years later, less than 400 years later, this structure is destroyed by the Babylonians. They come in, they conquer Israel, they capture the king's sons and gouge, they kill the king's sons in front of him and gouge out his eyes. This is the last thing you're going to see, is watch your sons die, and then we're going to gouge out your eyes. And they brutally take the people of Israel as slaves. This temple, though it was one of the great buildings of the day, it couldn't save anyone. Even the sacrifices that took place there ultimately only were efficacious. That is, they were only effective in that they pointed toward Christ. For the blood of bulls and goats could never fully remove the stain of sin. You needed Jesus. This is why Jesus came. Jesus came to seek and to save that which was lost. Jesus came because we could not earn our own salvation. It doesn't matter how many sacrifices and offerings. The scriptures say, sacrifice and offering, thou wouldest not. God did not desire. You couldn't earn salvation by any work. That's why Jesus came. He came to suffer and die in our place. We talked about that this morning. We can have salvation when we place our faith in him, when we completely trust what he did on the cross. Jesus' death pays the penalty for my sins, and there is nothing else that can save me. Not the temple, not the church, not giving money to the church, not becoming a member of the church, not being baptized in the church, none of it. Only faith in Jesus Christ. All of that being said, this passage shows me, and that's why I titled it this way, Solomon's house versus the Lord's house. To me, it displays a clear contrast between these two structures. Between Solomon's palace and hall, throne room hall, and his wife's huge house. Each structure being bigger than the temple of the Lord, which is way more significant because of what happens there. Solomon puts more time, money, and effort into his own house, and this gives us a glimpse of Solomon's declining heart for God. Again, eventually he falls so far away from the Lord that he'll only be a shell of the spiritual giant that he once was. And it starts with his relationship with a lost woman, and it continues as we talked about a few minutes ago. I want a bigger house. I want more. And what we're going to see throughout Solomon's story is eventually he wants more and he gets more stuff. And that same type of thing happens to people today. These are some of the big ones. Sinful relationships and a covetous desire for more stuff, for more things, for the bigger bank account, for the bigger house, for the newer, nicer car. And people follow their hearts instead of their Bibles. They want more. An insatiable desire for more, for extravagance. And the quest for those things becomes a stumbling block in their relationship with the Lord. So I'm going to ask you, because in this passage I look at it and I say, man, I don't know this for sure. I don't. But the passage really seems to show a priority problem with Solomon here. The passage strongly suggests a priority problem in Solomon's life here. And that's just me being fair. That's me being, I guess I would put, I can't see it any other way. I don't want to be super dogmatic about it, but I'm being a little dogmatic about it, all right? So I want to say strongly suggests instead of proves, strongly suggests a priority problem in Solomon's life, where Solomon is starting to put things above the Lord. We already know he's done it by marrying Pharaoh, by building her house. We already know that Solomon's putting things above the Lord. And I would ask you, what are you putting above the Lord? Is it your marriage? Or some romantic relationship? Is it your children and their desires? Is it sports or entertainment or leisure or rest or house or car or job or lands or bank accounts or stocks or retirement fund or whatever? You say, it's ridiculous. Nobody does that. Nobody puts their house above the Lord. Nobody puts their car above the Lord, or their job above the Lord, or their girlfriend or boyfriend above the Lord. Nobody does that. That's ridiculous. And I would say, you are mistaken if you think that way about a great many things. People do. They do put things above the Lord all the time. They do. Every time someone misses worship for work, they've put something above the Lord. Every time they miss worship for sports or leisure, they're putting something above the Lord. Every time someone fails to give the Lord his portion, let's say a tenth, because they have to pay this bill or that bill or whatever, they're putting that thing above, they're robbing God, and they're putting that thing above the Lord. And it could be, you don't know how big my mortgage is. And I would say, well, what do you think I would say? My mortgage is too high. My car payments are too high. I can't. Say, if your mortgage is too high and your car payment is too high, I'd argue against the car payment personally. If your car payment is too high. So if your expenses are so high that you are sinning, then you need to change your expenses. You change them. Because that's idolatry. It is. Those things that I mentioned, in those various fields, they're all idolatry. Idolatry is anything that you're willing to disobey God in order to have. That's idolatry. It's an idol. It's something you want so badly that you're willing to compromise your faith or your obedience or your worship. It's idolatry. In this passage, we get a glimpse at some potential idolatry in Solomon's life. We do. And of course, we're going to see later on that Solomon becomes a full-on idolater. He does. He just completely turns and worships false gods. We see just the crack become, in his armor, just become a shattered piece of armor, and a man who now chases after other gods. Timeless principle that this passage suggests is that you need to put God before everything else in life, lest you fall into idolatry, like Solomon did, and cause great harm to yourself and to the people around you. Anyway, if you have any questions or comments about that passage, I did the best I could to get through 51 verses, was it? 51 verses, I think? 51 verses. I did the best I could to get through 51 verses in 35 minutes. I feel like I did okay with it. I feel good about it. You guys feel good about that? I feel good about that. But we are 5 minutes over. Sorry about that. Those 5 minutes were taken up in my encouragement and my kind words to you guys. So don't judge me too harshly on that. Let's take our hymnals and turn to 421. If you have questions about the passage, come